Okay, here we are. So what are the questions which I want to address today? The title of this lecture series is Practicing Democracy in the Digital Age. And I think when you talk about democracy, the question of participation moves very quickly high on the agenda. What does it mean to be democratic? And in this context of developing complex digital health environments, which has been part of my research, I want to ask tonight, what does giving voice, participation, representation actually mean in such contexts? And who actually can get or gets voice in shaping these environments? And then secondly, how do digital health technologies actually participate in shaping new forms of digital health citizenship? So when I say digital health citizenships, I mean, on the one of a citizenship is for me always something that is connected to rights and obligations in a way. So it's a relation to a particular way of governing. And when I speak of digital health, then we have to think about how does health intervene in the way how I can be a citizen or how I'm regarded as a citizen. And then the digital comes added to it, if you want so, which changes both the notion of health, because we go much more towards data solutions, and you will see how I will argue that, but it also changes the way how we understand citizenship. And then finally, how can we be attentive to new kinds of inequalities and exclusions emerging as spillover effects of innovation processes? So unintended collateral impacts that we are, and of the currently, so spillover of the current accompanying governance models. And what do I mean by accompanying governance models? For example, how are things regulated? Who is imagined to be protected by regulations or not? Who is envisioned as a citizen when we speak about these kinds of things? Okay, so here we go. And I want to start with something that, let's think for a second how we envision societies we live in and we innovate for, because we speak about technological decisions, so we speak about some kinds of innovation. And this is a quote which I took from a book by a sociologist of time, Barbara Adam and Christopher Groves. It was published in 2007 and is called Future Matters, Actions, Knowledge, and Ethics. And I think this very short quote kind of nicely captures the background against which we have to understand these changes. It says, industrial capitalist societies are inescapably wedded to innovation and progress. Change rather than stability is the order of the day. In this dynamic world of universal mobility, standing still means falling behind. This committed pursuit of novelty distinguishes this contemporary mode of being, so aspired to across the world from other socioeconomic systems in which the creation of permanence and stability was and is the desired goal, where products were and are crafted to last, where political structures are designed to endure, and people conduct their social relations with a fair measure of predictability. Now, this already captures very nicely different elements that we have to be attentive to when we think about practicing democracy in digital societies. So we start from this idea that the way we run our societies is actually geared towards quick change, the novelty, the new, and standing still is kind of frightening us. It's tied to this idea of falling behind. We are committed to this new and to finding ever new things, and this trickles down into the very part of the university where research is being done also with this. The more we publish, the more we get projects, the more, etc. So there is this drive towards faster and more. So, and I think so that is a bit the folio against which I would like to give my presentation today. But we also have to stop for a moment and think, what do I mean when I say democracy, and what do I mean? And I personally, I'm very fond of Yaron Ezrahi's definition of democracy, because it very nicely makes us aware that this is not a stable object. It's not an entity that we can easily define. And he says, a democratic society cannot fully or at every moment be a democracy. Its precarious existence depends upon mutually reinforcing democratic ideas, political culture, political imaginaries, but also the institutions and practices. And here we are in the middle of what we're doing today. These very elements which make a system of government democratic almost never fully coexist in any society. So a democracy, like any other political regime, must be imagined and performed by multiple agencies in order to exist. And then he goes on with a very nice metaphor, which I like very much. He says, like a symphony, democracy has to be performed reasonably well in order to be realized as a political world. And I think this is so important, and I would like to stress and underline this performed reasonably well, the reasonably I would like to underline, because of course, there is nothing like the perfect, and I will come back to that with a different reading at the end of my talk. There is nothing like this perfect world out there, but we have to look for the reasonable. And Ezra adds to that he says, democracy always rests on an identifiable number of necessary fictions. So we have to kind of imagine the kind of parts of a democracy. And he says, for example, this idea of there is an autonomous subject, the citizen. There's a specific combination that we act on knowledge, etc., etc. So there are these ideas that we have about the perfect world in which we would like to live. And these fictions serve as a heuristic assumption for the exploration of the role of the political imagination in the making and unmaking of democratic regimes. So these necessary fictions, we always need to be attentive to the assumptions, one could call that also straightforwardly, to the number of assumptions that we build into our ideals of democracy. And in that sense, but there are always assumptions. There is no assumptionless or empty. There is no democracy that is empty of these assumptions. And I think you will see from my cases I will give you in a minute why this is then so important to me. Okay, so let's go on and look at something very pragmatic. We have a problem and the digital is supposed to be the solution. So we have a problem and we find a technological solution. Now, what we know from many studies is those who can define what the problem is, so who can define the framing, also frames the potential solutions. And the other way around, defining something as the solution also means that we frame the potential problems. If I tell you that collecting all health data is the solution, then I say as a problem, the problem are the citizens that do not want to collect, and the problem are the providers who do not give us good platforms, and the problem is, so you see what I mean? When we define what the solution is, we also shape the problem accordingly. And the other way around, once somebody has the power to define what the problem is, and you will see in a minute that I give you some examples, that of course the solutions will look accordingly. Now, let me make an excursion far away from the digital to just show you how I think about technological development and innovations. And two thinkers have been really important in my mind for that. The first was a historian / philosopher of science, and Estiesa, who has written this famous article, Do Artifacts Have Politics? So do technologies or innovations have a political character? And the other person is Madeleine Akridge, who has, I forgot the year, in 1992, written a really nice article where she points to the fact that specific visions and orders are always already written into, so inscribed into any technology we develop. And as an example, I would like to take a very simple example, so not a complex digital platform or anything, but I would like to take a very mundane technology, the so-called tomato harvesting machine. This is you see one here, so it runs over the fields and kind of collects the tomatoes. It's a very mundane technology, which was meant to simply support those who have to do the hard manual labor to pick the tomatoes and put them into this kind of carriage, okay? But when you look what it did, it was bringing this machine, and this machine, I have to tell the full story, this machine was developed by a university, so it was freely offered to the peasants as a kind of act of local kind of goodwill in a way. So the fascinating part of that story is then, let's look what this machine does. You see the size, it was a quite biggish machine. So first of all, it requested a restructuring of land and of ownership. Because evidently, if you just have a small piece of land to harvest tomatoes, a harvesting machine does not work. It's too small and it cannot move, etc. So peasants were asked to put their land together. So ownership changed. So they had to create consortia of peasants. So this leads to a collectivizing the growing of tomatoes, leaving little to no place to smaller owners, because of course their ways of producing were much more labor intensive and therefore also more costly. This changed evidently the work culture, and of course it killed a segment of the labor market, that you had labor that did actually the tomato harvesting. So we have a whole loss of labor. And at the end, and now comes the funny thing, of course, not all tomatoes are good to be harvested by this machine, because it actually takes the tomato and puts it in this kind of into the truck. But the point is, if the skin of the tomato is too thin, the tomato gets squeezed and you cannot use it on the market. So actually you grow different tomatoes that fit the machine and not the machine that fits the tomatoes. Okay, so we learn from that a mundane example, a technology replacing labor by picking up tomatoes, kind of changed ownership structures, made things much more, pushed out smaller kind of entrepreneurs, changed the work culture, etc., etc. So we see that technologies, even if they are not intended to do so, they have a particular idea of how work goes scripted into them. And here the idea of these people was, oh, we have this big land and we run with the machines over this big land. And they did not think about the many, many smaller producers that actually wanted to use that. And Madeleine Arkwright in her work calls that a script. So technologies are scripted. So they have put in a particular way of using the technology and of how the surrounding has to adapt to the technology in order that it functions well. And scripts in that sense, it's like you have to imagine it's like a theater play. It tells you how to play your role and what to do, etc., etc. So scripts reorder the world in specific ways and define ways of acting. And they create, and this she underlines importantly, and this is very essential for my argument, they create what she calls new geographies of responsibility. So actually new ways of distributing responsibility between the different actors, and actors in her sense means humans, but also the machines. What do the machines do? So there's a totally different arrangement that is being put in place. So this short excursion to tomatoes should not have brought us away from the digital, but should have given us a first hint towards one of my key arguments, namely to say, there is nothing like an innocent digital technology, but digital technologies always produce something. They always bring something about. Okay, now I will take you to very shortly to two projects. The one is called Smart for Health. And Smart for Health is one of this really, I mean, for a social scientist, gigantic Horizon 2020 projects for developing, testing, and validating a health data platform prototype for exchanging European electronic health records. So the basic idea is that citizens collect and manage their own health and health data in a digital format. So you can carry that with you on your mobile phone, or you can enter a kind of web space where you have all your health related information. Then they can share this information with either healthcare professionals, but also with other actors they trust. For example, I can share that with close people if I'm afraid that once I fall ill, that somebody would have to have access to my health information. And of course, as today, as usual, we want to provide these data for research. We want that people can have the option to provide these data for research. Our role as social scientists in that project is to establish a co-creation environment. So to establish an environment in which potential users can participate in the design and development process of such a platform. And so this opens up the question of whose values matter then when shaping such digital technologies. And that comes to the core question, like who gets voice, who can participate, and how do we imagine representation? The other project I would like to kind of use your imagination to think about these questions is the Austrian biobanking network. And what is a biobank? A biobank is nothing like an infrastructure that collects, stores, and provides a large number of human materials like blood or skin or some tumors or things like that, and data, often combined also with clinical information. So you go to the hospital, you have a certain disease, or you have some condition, or you have etc. And for example, you are asked, could you give us additional blood, or can we biobank some of the tumor tissue, etc., etc. And we are, as social scientists, part of this Austrian BBMRI, so biobanking network. And we aim at gaining a better understanding of how this infrastructural resource is valued, actually. So for whom is it a value? By different actors. And actors, I mean citizens, researchers, management, policymakers, etc. We want to address the complex relation that is performed between biological data and being a citizen with rights and obligations, etc. And it's important for us to reflect how the decisions are taken to provide biological biomaterial and data for research. So these are the kinds of questions that we are working with as social scientists. So this is the background against which I will develop my thoughts and show you what it means to think about voices, participation, etc. So this is deeply empirically rooted in the sense that I've been working with a lot of citizens in the first project and with a lot of researchers and citizens in the second project on these questions of participation, voice, etc. Now, how do citizens understand the biobank? This is a really interesting question we are exploring because it's fascinating. Actually, they encounter a medical professional, as you see on the left side of this picture. And what is between them is an informed consent sheet. And this informed consent sheet is the only moment when a patient, a citizen, can decide whether or not he or she is ready, is willing and ready to donate or to provide for the material, the bodily material, or the data for research. And of course, citizens and donors' values and visions of health and research and political environment in which we're in, all that matters enormously here at that moment. But the interesting thing which we found out in speaking to a number of people is actually that what happens after that is highly invisible to citizen donors. Once they have given away the material or the data, they do not really know what's happened behind that smoke screen that is in the middle of this graphic. And then you have different kinds of biobanks. And in these biobanks, they transform, order, standardize, and store these materials in order to either go into the research system or in the context of using the donated sample in the healthcare, in the health system or healthcare system, for example, to do population studies or things like that. And of course, citizens ask themselves, where do my materials actually go? And could I say it should not go here and it should go there? How do I trust that people do actually the things they promise to do with my data, et cetera, et cetera. So just for you to have an idea what we are looking at when we look at biobanks. Now, this is embedded in much wider stories of future making. And I think this quote from the Commissioner Stella Kyriakides is extremely interesting to look at when we think about a digital health. So today, she says, we present another pillar of the European Health Union. I dare to say the backbone. Today, we propose a European health data space, an initiative that brings us closer to making health data work for patients, people, and innovation. So the trope is we work for patients, people, and innovation, which is interesting because they symmetrize innovation and patients and people. And the European health data space has then two basic aims. The first is to enable citizens to share health data, for example, their medical history, test results, or prescriptions with hospitals and medical practitioners in and across member states. And the European health data space's second aim is to revolutionize how we use health data for research, innovation, and policymaking. For all the above to work, trust is vital. And here comes my argument. Strong privacy and security protection is how we will build this trust, When it comes to our citizens, they can be confident that their personal health data will be handled with the greatest care, underpinned by strong data protection rules and data security. The European health data space will give citizens complete control over their data. They will be able to add information, rectify errors, restrict access, and find out which health professionals have accessed their data. And then comes a while nothing, and then comes the sentence, and it will save us more than 10 billion euros in 10 years. And I find that very interesting because here we have this discourse coalition, we could call that, with Martin Heyer, namely on the one hand, so everybody profits. The citizens will profit because they get better healthcare, but they will not be as expensive anymore. And they say themselves, trust is vital, but they think that trust is created through privacy and security protections. And what we see in our research, that trust is essential for people, but they do not build trust on the privacy and security protection. This is important to them, so I don't say that. But they want to see who are the actors in there, how do these actors act in the real world, how can they see where their data flow and go? So this is a kind of control and transparency narrative, much more than a privacy and security narrative that we get from citizens when we speak to them. And then, of course, it's innovation. It says, oh, it's really important for innovation to drive that, to revolutionize our, et cetera, et cetera. And finally, we want to save money because, people get expensive because they get old, and that is a problem for us. And so that is the trope that we have an aging society that has a lot of comorbidities, et cetera, and costs a lot of money. That's roughly the tone against which all these things are happening. And aligned with that, or comes the so-called empowering discourse, where we say, we want person-centered care, and we want citizens to become involved in care. We want that citizens can become a valuable human resource, which is an interesting formulation, by the way, to health and social care systems. So humans become a resource to systems, which is crucial considering. And finally, citizens can also help, and this is a big argument, improve the quality of care by having the possibility to give feedback and health data related to treatment or health condition. So here we see what we are talking today about is this idea of an innovation-driven society that has this problem of an aging society, where the digital is a solution towards it, and it is for the best of the citizen, etc. Now, the citizens actually see that much more nuanced in many ways, and I would like to share a bit also of that. Actually, we have witnessed a kind of participatory turn that is reflected in this, the citizen is central, and that has started well earlier than these European documents, and is not just limited to the health sector. So in the health sector, however, particularly, we see the hope for a shift from a hierarchical and paternalistic mode to a more collaborative and inclusive relationship between experts and ordinary members of society, so citizens, patients, affected people, etc. But here we also see something which Boltanski and Thévenot And the paper I've given you to read for today's lecture is very much tapping also into that literature. We see a shift in the orders of worth that are predominantly present. So an order of worth is a set of kind of ideas and values that guide us. And every society, Boltanski and Thévenot would say, have a set of these orders of worth that guides our way of acting. And what we can observe in the medical field is a bit the move from a domestic order of worth to what Boltanski and Thévenot call a civic order of worth. So to give more space to citizens, patients, publics to raise their voice. So the domestic order then stands for importance of authority, esteem, and reputation. So the classical medical model. So trustworthy comes by the status, and it's customary, so it's embedded and ingrained in the system, etc. And the civic order, in contrary, is more this idea of collectivity, collective welfare, equality and solidarity, and other values that. And what we can see is that such shifts from the one order to other, obviously, I mean, this is nothing very astonishing, comes with frictions when these different orders encounter each other, because they have to compete and try to become or remain dominant in a specific setting at a specific moment in time. So for us as analysts, it's particularly interesting to look at these frictions that arrive, and we take them as key moments of learning and essential in terms of democracy, because how well functioning a democracy is actually, we can see in the moments when frictions occur, and we see how the otherwise tacit issues get more explicit and outspoken and become more visible in that sense. Now, the notion of friction I borrow from Tsing's work, which underlines that frictions are nothing else than productive engagements. And she has this wonderful analogy where she says, a wheel turns because it encounters a surface on the road, and spinning in the air, it goes nowhere. So rubbing two sticks together produces heat and light. One stick alone is just a stick. And as a metaphorical image, then friction reminds us that heterogeneous and unequal encounters can lead to new arrangements of culture and power. So in that sense, it's extremely interesting as analysts to look at these friction. And Tsing underlines that we live at an age where we imagine everything can flow and travel, and our health data or bodily samples inclusive, so they can go to other countries, to other regions, we can combine them, etc. But this never comes without frictions. Any globalization comes with frictions, because and in Tsing's book, which is called, by the way, Frictions, she very nicely outlines these globalization movements and what kinds of frictions they create. And in that sense, I understand criticism and disagreement when I speak to those people who participate or who claim voice. Disagreement are a crucial dimension in and of any participatory process. The participatory process is as good as it allows for criticism and disagreement, because criticism is constitutive and performative and extremely important. It advances and does not hinder a process. And so it's important to allow that and to open up space. And I have become aware how uneasy people feel about when they see difficulties arising, frictions arising, they think they have to smoothen that out immediately. No, it's very important to see this as moments where creative spaces are digged out by people, where voice is actually claimed, where participation is actually done actively. Now, let me shortly look at these two cases and just put them next to each other. Why did I tell both of them? So what is the main objective of both? What do they have in common, this health data platform and the biobank? Actually, both realize the datafication, so the digitalization of biomedicine and health. While the health data platform creates what I want to call data bodies, so a kind of equivalent of the human body. They become an infrastructure through which users are expected to make sense of their health and ways of living more generally. So citizens are expected to collect the data, to watch the data, and to behave according to these data, kind of change their livelihoods, kind of do more of this, do less of that, etc. On the other side, the biobank is this idea that a growing data sample, it's a growing data sample infrastructures for research, and at the end of the day, the hope for improving the treatment. So both have this idea of future orientation and improving health, the one with involving the people much more, the other one through research and treatment. But then, of course, as I said, we have to, if we go back to the tomato harvesting machine, we have to imagine how users, citizens, and patients are imagined and performed in any of these participatory exercises. And here, the interesting thing is that, and Ezrahi speaks of this necessary fiction, the necessary fiction that we discover here is that there is this rational, responsible, and solidary citizen. Rational in the sense, if I give him information, he will behave according, or she will behave accordingly. Responsible, he or she will think of the collective and not just of herself or himself. And finally, we have the solidary citizen, and we'll come back to the notion of solidarity in a minute, who is able to, who is acting in a way, in an expected manner, to contribute to the public good. Now, this is interesting because we can, of course, ask, so what other roles do we have? Is there just one rationality? Who defines what is rational? Is there just one kind of behavior, which is who defines what is seen as responsible, etc.? So this goes much deeper. And is participation complying to certain rules, or is participation speaking up, rejecting, creating frictions, etc.? So as we see for the health data platform, we expect citizens to support digital health activities, to show engagement, and of course, at the end of the day, the hope that they would provide these data they have, this data work they have done to provide this data for research, so that research can advance and will advance in these directions. And on the other hand, we also expect citizens to provide samples and data to further biomedical research. So in both cases, we have this, as I said, one model of the rational, responsible, and solidary citizen. But we do not have other models available in the sense of saying, I do not trust, because I'm not sure that the outcomes, for example, of a medical treatment will also be good for me, or if my health insurance will not, for example, cover this or that. So we see that these questions are actually omnipresent in both cases. The question for whose good is it? And of course, always also connected to the fear of abuse, to the fear of exclusion, to the fear of that the data might go somewhere where they don't see where they go, and that might create a problem. Now, when we continue, we immediately see, as said before, there is this battle of orders of worth. We see that different groups of actors are involved, and they have very different modes of ordering that are dominant and that they would like to keep. In the project on the health data platform, we collaborate with tech developers of different kinds, with medical professionals, and of course with future users / non-users, so people that would participate, but decide not to engage or start collecting their health data electronically. And this is already interesting because, of course, tech developers have a very different starting point for why they want to develop such a thing, with what means, what are their previous experiences. As I said before, with the tomato harvesting machine, they have a particular imagination of where things should go. And on the other hand, so of course you can imagine now there are three players that come from fundamentally different environments and with fundamentally different modes of ordering that are kind of battling here together. And when we work with citizens and we come up and say, okay, citizens would kind of see that as an improvement if this and that is done, I quite often get the answer, yeah, that's maybe feasible, but that would be much too costly to do. That would not be worthwhile, or it's too complex and unstable, or this is not the state of the art. We don't do that, etc., etc. So it's kind of interesting. And this is not a critique. This is not an easy critique towards tech developers. It just shows that everybody has his or her own orders of worth in the field they are embedded in. And of course, medical professionals say things like, oh, I would be happy to use such a platform. However, it must be fast. I have to have access within a couple of seconds, because otherwise in my everyday life, this has no place. And so it's very interesting that the temporalities in medical treatment then matter, whether or not such a health data platform can actually come to life. When I move to the side of the biobanking, we have a different constellation. We have clinicians who actually encounter patients, which they also ask to donate samples for the biobank. But then we also have the professional group of biobankers who want to run their biobank according to certain kind of standards and principles, and who see that as a professional infrastructure provider and has different maybe interests. And for example, they are interested in having the samples, etc. And then we have citizen patients, and citizen patients would very much like to know more about what happens with their data, where do they go, how are they used? And this is notoriously difficult to kind of open that up without disclosing any identity of patients that have donated material. And so you see already how difficult it is, this kind of negotiation. So even if citizen patients would want to participate and want to see where their data go, this is notoriously difficult to realize. And there are some examples international, but in many cases, this has turned out to be quite complex. And then we can ask ourselves, in these projects, where are the spaces of participation? So where can citizens actually have voice? So in the Health Data Platform project, so in Smart for Health, actually our role as social scientists was to explicitly formulate user requirements. So what do users want? With no clear, but yet they don't have a clear implementation transparency. So we have put in place a tool that tracks the implementation of user requirements, but evidently not all the requirements will and can be realized. And this creates this kind of space in which the idea of, is that now our tool and have we really participated, is questioned over and over again. So when is it when is it in the power of the tech people and the medical folks, and when do my contributions actually count? And what we have seen when we have spoken with hundreds of people in several hundreds of people in very different constellations, trying out platform features, asking them to use certain features, etc. And it was fascinating for me to see, of course, how balanced some of the judgments are, how refined the visions are, but at the same time, how difficult it is as a citizen to understand these digital kind of infrastructures. So the difficulty starts, so the interface can still be clear, but then the question, where do these data go? Where are they stored? Who can access with them? Are questions that are really bugging. And this is something that kind of is very, very strongly there. And actually representation is a challenge here. And let me give you a very nice example. You all remember this project was run in the middle of a pandemic. And so it was for quite a while not possible to really encounter physically people, or people did not want to encounter us. And some countries that were participating did actually forbid us to travel there, et cetera, et cetera. So it was complicated. So what we did is we tried to develop digital formats of participation in which we could work with people on that. But of course, evidently, this has a huge flaw as a replacement methodology, because of course we could only address people who are already digital literate. And we cannot get those people who have difficulties to access the digital world. And so participation here became something that was actually a privilege for those who could participate in a digital world already in the first place, but not for those who could not. And we had one case which was particularly interesting. He was at a discussion group with us before the pandemic broke out. And we actually did individual interviews afterwards to deepen certain aspects. And we thought that this person had some very interesting insights to offer. And we wanted to interview him in that case over Zoom. And he gave us, so we wrote this email and he gave us a very nice answer saying, yeah, he can write emails, but that's absolutely what he can do. And he has no device that can use Zoom, and he has never used Zoom, and he has no data plan beyond being able to send a couple of emails. And here it really struck me that as a researcher, we have to realize that we tested a digital participatory design process in a digital environment, which of course excludes already people who do not have that access. And we have seen in Austria, for example, during the pandemic, where we started by saying, let's put the schooling online. And then we realized that many hundred thousands of children did not have access to the internet, nor to proper computer devices to actually participate in schooling. So we have to ask ourselves, what is our basic assumption about society here? And are here inequalities not kind of reinforced and even strengthened through these processes? And of course, the last thing is participation is a very long-term thing, actually. And the use or the non-use is a form of feedback on the long run. But of course, very often we want to see success in the short. And if you are in a project mode, like these European projects, you have to prove success within a short period. However, transformative ways, and in particular participatory transformations, take much longer than what is imagined 3 to 4 years in a European project. And I think that's one of the takeaways in learning about digital democracies, is actually that we carefully have to think about the temporalities or the timing that is built into these imaginations. And on the other side, when you go to the biobanking, I showed you this moment where the patient is asked by the clinician, do you give us the right to collect samples or data from you and put them into a biobank? This is the informed consent process is the moment where you have a second of individual choice in a collective problem framing. And so it's very interesting. So there is this illusion of choice, which is then replacing very often the situation of care, where you need more time, where you need to think about that, et cetera, et cetera. So you have this second to sign things. That's why, for example, some countries do not allow you, if somebody comes in with an emergency case, to ask them for a donation of anything. You can only do that if it's a scheduled surgery where people would have time some days before the surgery, is not under pressure of the surgery to agree or to not agree to donate tissue or anything else. Now, we have been speaking a lot about voice, participation, representation. Now, all that kind of gravitates around how do we value something, or how do we express our values as citizens? And here there is a very nice piece of writing which says, actually, when we think about value, we always think the person A values this. And actually, very often we have to think in valuation constellations. So actually, we change our visions of values along different lines. And so they point out that valuations are always happening in constellations. So there is a valuator, let's say me, I value something, I express an evaluation. The valuee is, what do I value? For example, the citizen data platform. And the audience is a policy audience, or my colleagues or citizens, or my colleagues from the tech sciences or so. And so in each of these kind of configurations, I will maybe make a different assessment. So if I speak to citizens, I might speak in a different way of presenting the problem than if I speak to a highly complex policy audience, etc. And what I value in that platform might also be something very different, because I highlight values that are related to the audience to which I speak. And of course, all that happens also in a specific space. And so there are always rules of valuation. So you value, if you sit in a university auditorium, you express your values differently than you sit over, I don't know, a beer in the pub in the countryside with your friends, and you speak about things. And then, of course, we have infrastructures that allows us to value. For example, I can say studies have shown that in Austria, 3,500 people were saved from this and that disease because they did a regular monitoring on this and that and that. So I have these infrastructures that help me to make evaluations and to distribute also evaluations. So it is important to say that valuation is never something stable. So something is not good or is not bad or is not something, but it is in a specific situation expressed towards an audience, it becomes this value is attached to it. And this is really interesting when we think about democracy also, and we think about participation. We have always to think about in which constellation do we judge that quality? And where and when do we say this is a good democratic process or it's not a good democratic process? To whom do we say that? Etc., etc. So this is really, really important to think in these terms and to assess that. Now, let's move back to these two cases then. What is then the basis for decision making? And in that sense, how do we consider this situatedness? So the valuation constellations. First of all, a point that comes recurrently is the issue of transparency and trust. And actually, I've shown this, this graphic of the smoke screen that people do not know what happens after. It's very similar with the health data platform. People upload their data, but they do not understand where do they go, where are they material somewhere, who can touch them, etc. So what is transparency builds on the anticipation, and trust, builds on the anticipation that a specific set of expectations and promises will be or have been met, always with an acceptable level of disappointment, which can be factored in. So nobody of our participants said everything has to be perfect, but all of them underlined that they expect some form of stability in the relationships, that they can calculate how, and that's how they judge actors, for example, and that's why they are hesitant towards industry and they are more trustworthy towards university settings, etc., because it's this kind of specific sets of expectations and promises that come along with these institutions. And the acceptable level of disappointment. Many people can quote that they have been disappointed by big corporate actors. That does not mean that every big corporate actor is not a good actor, but and of course we have to see that their trust relations always come in several layers. So do they trust institutions, and in that sense, that brings me back to what is valued actually. Is it now the technical feasibilities of the platform, or is it the player that is behind that platform? So is it public or private, etc. The second point, which is important for decision-making and participation in that sense, is understanding of the infrastructures. And this sounds easy and is extremely complex because many users have a limited capacity to understand and actually navigate the health data landscape or the biobank processes and negotiate a position within these infrastructures. And this is very important if we think about voicing, participating, representing, etc. I mean, we have to find a space from where we can voice, participate, etc. And this space has to be within, in a sense, the process and the infrastructure. And for that, I have to understand where I have to go in a symbolic sense, where I have to go to voice my concerns. The third point, which is important, is the digital data or sample justice. And they spell that out very differently in our discussions. And potential outcomes are carefully scrutinized to be inclusive and attentive to diversity and the different and to the different capacities to encounter these complex environments. And justice is then not just a simple, something is not just or is not just, but it's really a relationship, a process. It's an attention to inclusivity and to diversity, etc. So it's neither, as I argued a bit for democracy, it's neither something that is a well-defined, stable thing, but it's really something that has to be re-performed and rethought each time when you change something or when something specific comes up. Finally, there's a lot of question like control and choice is a lot voiced in participatory settings. Can I decide to end a provision relationship? What does this entail? And up to what degree is it possible at all? And this is very clear in personal relationship. I can break my relationship with any of you, and I can simply not speak to you anymore. But I do not know where my data actually are, and I do not know whether I have control over that and whether I can actually re-extract my data and kind of re-own them in that sense. And that comes with the question, to whom do I want to provide my data, etc. And then you have this call for solidarity on different levels that they are confronted with, but they also voice when they speak about participation and representation. And so solidarity, and I use Barbara's and Alina's definition, it's an enacted commitment to carry the costs. And the cost is under quotation mark because it's financial, social, emotional, and other contributions of assisting others with whom a person or persons recognize similarity in a relevant aspect. Now, we saw that this is extremely complex to create this environment of solidarity. This works quite well if you have communities where people share a kind of disease. Very often in the case of rare diseases, it gets much more difficult if it's something very general, like please keep all your data up to date, all your health data up to date, and please donate them to whatsoever. It's very unclear who would be the group with whom I should be solidary. And this idea, which I read to you from the European Commission, that this will improve all our health and well-being, et cetera, is actually not very credible from the side of people. And they think that they should participate, but they cannot participate in shaping these things, but they should participate in donating or in providing. And this is seen as a problem because it comes without a clear vision of potential return, and in particular, not so much even on return, but a commitment to the public good. So if this really leads to an improvement, will this improvement be for everybody? Or will it be for a selected group of people, et cetera, et cetera? So the question of the public good and the accessibility of public goods is a really big question that is up for people. And finally, it's about the redistribution of responsibilities. And this is particularly visible in the health data platform, not so much in the biobanking, but in the health data platform, it is interesting to see because collecting your health data comes with the expectation that you as a good citizen will then watch these data and try to be as close as possible to good data, whatever that means. So care for your own health and use these digital health information that you get in order to behave accordingly and not become a problem for the collective. And this is, of course, kind of comes with concern, in particular for people who are more vulnerable, who fear that their insurance situation is not so safe, or who feel that they might get excluded from certain things because they are a liability in that sense, because they have a health problem which others do not have. Okay, so that brings me to my non-concluding conclusions. I cannot, a story like that has no full conclusions in the sense, because what I try to describe is that we are in the middle of a process of technological transformation in the digital world, in a democratic environments, and that we have to think of it continuously and accompany that process with our thinking. We started from this practicing democracy in the digital age. And what I have tried to show is, and we have asked this question, is giving voice, participation, representation in tech development the way to build democratic digital innovation societies? And I tried to show the difficulties that we meet when we try to do that. Who is included? Who gets voice? What do they voice? And is that, what do people voice? And are they being heard? So the question is not only to have voice and to participate, but the question is, and of course we have to ask who represents whom, and I will come to that in a minute. But at the end of the day, the question is like, does it matter? Does it make a difference? Does voice and participation, and to what degree does it make a difference? And the complex issue of participation is that it can become quite exclusive. As I told you, there was a little story about thinking about the digital in the digital realm. And so you exclude people who are not fully digital in a way to raise their voice. And it will not automatically lead to a situation of justice, even if you organize participation, because it will be necessarily always a process of selectivity, of spokespersonship, of representation. So in that sense, I would like to quote Calon and co-authors who speak about the imperfection of democracy. Yeah, in that sense, practicing democracy in a digital age, it's the imperfection that we need to consider. And representation simultaneously produces speech and silence. Quote, I say what you say, so you are invited to remain silent, at least for a time, and on some subjects. And I think it's important to think of it that way, that even if, like we do, we organize to integrate citizens and we kind of bring them in, this is a fascinating way that you can create closure and say, now we have asked them and now we do it that way. That's a decision and this is stable. And actually, the point here is that with making this closure, we also create new forms of silences. So with Calon, we have to attend to the situatedness, to the valuation constellations, and to the different moments in which value orders come to matter. And in that sense, practicing democracy in the digital age is a fluid situation in which we always have to rethink both the practicing and what we mean by democracy, as well as what technological change actually has already embedded. Just think about tomato ripening and how the tomatoes were changed in order to fit the machinery. So we have to pay attention that we do not make people fit our participatory machineries in order to be able to practice democracy. Thank you.